Okay. All right, so good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out on Hanukkah. Special accommodations for those that, either that or you didn't get invited to a masiba or some party, so whichever way it were. So, first of all, thank you to the Race family for sponsoring. This is now the third of this unit, and there have been previous units before of the RMEDS pharmacy. You have an acronym for this, don't you?
The monthly educational Dvar Halacha series.
The monthly educational Dvar Halacha series. MEDS. Got it? RMEDS. And it should be a refuah shalema for Sarah Gittel Bas Miral, Aaron Elimelech ben Brendel Leah, Miral Bas Sarah Gittel, and Bluma Bas Masha. So thank you to the Reeses for sponsoring this. It's really very special, and I'm really honored and privileged to have been asked to give a shiur or on this on in that series. Okay, so the topic advertised, it came out a couple of different ways, but I'm happy that it came out in different ways because I actually want to address that particular issue. So my version of this story is going to be cognitive delay, children with cognitive delay, and halacha. So an area that I practice in is pediatrics, as many of you know, and my interest is in halacha. So needless to say, this is a natural fit for me to look into this. Sometimes, when this was originally created, though, it was part of the Refuas HaNefesh series, which is a little bit different. It's translated as mental health. Now, the issue with mental health and cognitive delay is as follows: that to some extent there's an overlap between the two, but as with many things that we deal with, just because something is part of one subset doesn't mean that the other is part of the other subset. I'll explain what that means. It sounds a little too abstract and too philosophical for this thing. The notion is that, so cognitive delay may be part of mental health, but mental health may have nothing to do with cognitive delay. So the problem and the definitions are going to be very, very critical. And what I want to do is I perhaps want to narrow the scope of what may be a field which is beyond, in terms of the size and scope. When someone talks about mental health and halacha, so again, what are we thinking about? That's a huge area. So if you take out, for example, a textbook of psychiatry, is everything in there going to be, related to halachic issues? And the answer is, for the most part, they will bring up some questions. And I think Rabbi Lazer spoke a little bit, just to introduce the topic a little bit. So for example, let's take the classic cases, OCD. So if a person has OCD, and the question is that for them, when they're going to be, whether it be davening or doing any sort of ritual, their OCD gets in the way, and the question is going to be, there are going to be halachic issues that come up. And that's fine, and that deals specifically with that issue of OCD. But beyond that, the questions about somebody who has depression, someone who has anxiety, schizophrenia, and so on and so forth, how does that impact halacha? And that, again, it's just a very, very wide scope. To talk about cognitive delay in children, though, is something that what I want to address. I'm going to give you a couple of vignettes to try to narrow the focus of what I want to speak about, because those topics either have been dealt with or it's for a different time and different place. But it's lumped together in mental health because that's the nature of how people speak. But there is a fundamental difference. I'll give you some examples and then it'll sharpen this very clearly. So let's say, for example, we are going to speak about a child with Down syndrome, right? So a child with Down syndrome, in and of itself, does that constitute a mental health issue? By itself, technically not. I mean, the issue with Down syndrome is going to be, by the way, a child with Down syndrome can have anything that anybody has in this room. So they could have all of the mental health issues, but that's not built in, it's not intrinsic, right? So they could have depression, they can have anxiety, they can have OCD, but that's not part of the Down syndrome. But what is part of the Down syndrome is going to be their level of intelligence, their level of IQ. And the question becomes then, how do we deal with a child with IQ of, and we'll go through some of the technical parts in terms of the numbers, I'll present them later, but let's just leave that as a child with Down syndrome. And the question is, all the obligations and that come. So do the parents have to buy that child a pair of tefillin? Do they have to make a bar mitzvah for that child? Do they have to, keep kosher, and so on and so forth? All of the gamuts, which we'll, I hope to address this evening. But that's not it. People talk about, for example, autism. Another area that I kind of dabble in, so we'll say, right? So autism is by definition spectrum, and there are going to be two aspects to a child with autism. Say, for example, you have a very high-functioning autistic child who is, cognitively doing well, goes to university, or let's not, we'll keep it to pediatrics. So is now in grade 10 and 11, goes to school, functioning at a class level, has some social challenges, difficulties, and so on and so forth. The mere fact that they have a diagnosis of autism, does that lend itself to any new halachic questions? Right? Just on the basis of that alone. Just because a diagnosis has been made, does that mean that there is now fundamentally a halachic issue to look at? Or do you look at that and say, well, how is that different than, Joe Greenberg? How is that any fundamental difference? Far more interesting, or from a halachic perspective, and much more challenging, is going to be, what about some of the children that I see in my practice, which are going to be, for example, let's just take autism, but a nonverbal child. Now we have a 14-year-old who is nonverbal, and he is, he has a lot of behavior, dysregulation challenges, and now the questions that we're going to have to deal with are, number one, sure, the questions that we had before, do parents have to buy the tefillin and things like that, but we have a bigger question we're going to talk about, which is, the child can only be quiet can only regulate themselves with an iPad. It's Shabbos. Can the family make use of an iPad? The child, loves ice cream. You've just finished eating, your meat meal. Can you provide the child with ice cream in order to calm the child down? So that's the sort of child that you have with autism, or other children that we deal with. For example, cerebral palsy, and they have and they're let's not make it but essentially cerebral palsy, nonverbal, again, but without a diagnosis of autism, because you see where I'm getting at. In other words, the concept of mental health is just so broad that everything can fall into the category of mental health. And if you're going to sort of speak about mental health and halacha, you're ending up diluting it. So what I'd like to do is really just focus. Just let's get to, let's say, three or four different, vignettes that we're talking about. And the vignettes that we're going to discuss are going to be, yes, a diagnosis of autism, but cognitively very, very functional. And are there going to be any issues that we're going to see about that? And we're going to look at individuals with Down syndrome, which is a cognitive delay, and we'll look at some of those parameters. So that's really what I want to do. So I want to go through I went through some of the cases, and we have to start our point with basically some definitions. We need so till now I've been just talking about some medical definitions to some extent. We're going to need some halachic definitions, and then we're going to apply these to the cases that we've had using the parameters that we've set forth, and we'll talk about, as I said, we'll talk about kashrus, we'll talk about tefillin, we'll talk about bringing, children to shul, and all of these things from the prism of, now we have some halachic questions, right? So that's what it's going to be. So again, just before we debark this idea, like if a person has OCD and coming to shul, is that going to be a challenge? But that's not what we're going to talk. We're going to really stick on to what we had here. Okay, so if we're going to use our guide, in the short source sheet, I'm going to read as much as I get the feel that we're going to go there, but I will certainly make references to them. So if anybody wants to do some further reading, they will be able to look at that. So in the Talmudic literature, there is an expression which we know and we're familiar constantly. We refer to this as the cheresh, shote, v'katan. Okay? So the cheresh is translated most of the time as a deaf mute, and for the purpose of our discussion tonight, I'm not even going to touch that whatsoever, because none of the cases that we are talking about are so we'll just leave that aside, and that'll be a different topic to work on. Then there's the classification which was called a shota, which we're going to have to define what that means. What does it mean to be a shota? I mean, we use it in the vernacular and say, oh, that person is such a shota. That's something which is, devarim shebishtus. That's, but what does that mean? I mean, we need a precise definition, because we have to be able to apply that to our medical cases. In other words, does it apply? And the third thing that we have to talk about is going to be, something which is so cheresh, shota, v'katan. Katan we know is going to be underage. That's no problem. And Chazal have that category of exemptions, and we'll talk about what they're exempt from exactly. But then there's another category which we're going to see later on, which is somebody called a pesi or a peti. Okay. And we say this in davening. So, Torah Hashem Temima, Machkimat, altogether the song, Peti. So what does Peti mean? It means the simpleton. And we have to define what a simpleton means. Is that just, a non-scholar, or does that mean something much more? So let's work our way through some definitions and just try to see how they apply. So how do Chazal, circa 500, AD, define what is considered a shota, right? They didn't have a DSM classification. They didn't have any of this thing to go by. So how did they define it? So the Gemara tells us this is what the definition is. So the Gemara is a Gemara in Chagiga, and the Gemara in the context there is saying who has to come for Olas Re'iyah. In other words, every Yom Tov you had to come up. The Torah tells us you have to come up to visit Yerushalayim, and who is excluded, who is excluded. So the Gemara discusses the shota. Ezeu shota. Who is a shota? So the Gemara is now going to give us 3 examples of what the Gemara understands is acts that are consistent with a shota. Number 1, hayose yechidi balayla. And again, you have to remember this was written, when it was written, how it was written, and what the context was. This is one case where context is important. Okay? All right. It is important because, we're going to say you don't go out at night by one does not go out singularly on their own. Now, that may be applicable today as well, depending where you live, right? So my mother would certainly say that if you go out, when I was in Yeshiva University, and she said, you don't go out at night, she told me that, she would basically imply to me that that's a very shota thing to do, right? To go out and in the Bronx and in the 70s, in the 80s, you don't do those things. But is that necessarily something that's we're going to say transferable to where we are today? So we leave that as number 1. V'halon b'beis hakvaros, a person who decides to make an overnight trip in the cemetery. They pack a little night bag and they spend the night there. So that is number 2. The hamakareis kusaso, a person who tears his clothing. In other words, just basically wanton destruction is the Gemara. So the machlokus in the Gemara is now more of a technical nature, which is, and the Gemara goes through and says, Itmar, Rav Huna Amra Achiyu Kulon Bevasachas. In order to meet the criteria, so for any of the people that you're familiar with, the physicians here, we use DSM-5, right, or DSM, right? So there you have criteria. So you fulfill all of the criteria or not. So here, this is like the first DSM. Basically, the Chazal said, Rav Huna basically said, you have to check off all of the boxes. It's not enough to have just one. In other words, one is not a prototype. All 3 are required. At some point, the person has to do all 3. When you do all 3, now you've checked off the DSM, the original DSM in the box. Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, says, "Afilo ba'achas mehen." No, it's one is going to be sufficient. Now, we could spend the remainder of the time together learning this little piece of Gemara. It's a very interesting Gemara. The Gemara goes back and forth trying to understand, is it 3, is it 1? How do we understand it? But at the end, what we need to know from this here is the following. Leaving this aside, the more important question is, are these 3 representative of something which is that we have to be able to extrapolate? Or are we going to narrow it down and say, no, this is the definition. And if you don't do those 3 things, then you don't have it, then you don't meet the criteria. That would be the question. So that is really the challenge for, when we take a Gemara written, 1,500 years ago, and we're going to now extrapolate. We have to make that decision now. We, Chazal, are going to make that decision and say, what is that? Whether it's 3 or 1 is not going to be relevant. But which three it is or which one it is, that's going to be important to know. See the difference? The 3 versus 1 is not going to be the important machlokas. In other words, at the end of the day, a person who sleeps in a cemetery, are you going to then brand that individual and say that they have this thing? Okay. Now, so we're going to move forward to the tshuvas of Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe, basically, we know the posek ador for basically the 20th century. And he dealt with the following case. If I read it, it's going to take long, so I'm going to just try to summarize it. But I do want to read a few lines just to give you a sense of what it is. And for the people that do work in mental health, I would love to hear what your clinical diagnosis is going to be. So the question is as follows. I'm going to be in number 2 here. It came to my attention about an individual. I'm going to just maybe go through. While he was in his youth, and he had this leaning towards becoming very much in that category of what we'll call shtus. He said about himself, Shehu Mashiach. He actually thought he was Mashiach. Okay? In his youth, he called himself Mashiach. And this caused him to do many other activities which you define as shtus. What did he do? He would, for example, likra b'torah v'lios shatz v'afshein manichino. So, in other words, he wanted to be the chazan, but the shul didn't want to let him. And of course, that created a big controversy. So he got into big machlokas with everybody. So far, that doesn't sound very shtus. That sounds like every shtibel I know. That one guy wants to. He doesn't want to. I shouldn't get maftir. Okay, but we'll take it up a couple of notches. So he would argue with everybody. But one time, what does he do? The ira shalakach sefer Torah barach ha'imo. He grabs the sefer Torah from the shul and he runs away with it. Right? He's like, you don't want to let me daven? Okay. I take the Sefer Torah and I'm running away with it. It gets better. He goes from city to city. He says, I have to do tikkun olam. My job, I'm Mashiach, I have to fix the entire world. Okay? He would grab things from people and he would hide them. Right? In other words, he would say, I like that coat. He would grab your coat, go take it to his place, hide it, and you, Dr. Fink, have to now give me $100 to my gemach. That's what he would do. He would climb on trees, and he would start lecturing from treetops. Sometimes he went naked. He would say, I'm like Adam Harishon, Kodem Achet. Before he was given his little, leather, apparel. And many other type of things. And he continues saying that he had to things like this. Okay, so for the clinicians in the room, anybody with thing here, what would you call this individual? Yeah, I'm looking at you. Let's make this...
2 options.
Okay.
Or he has psychosis, schizophrenia, like grandiose ideas, the way you want to call it, or he's making that up.
Okay, so let's work with a medical diagnosis first. Right. So basically, you're going to say that there may be a psychosis here. Okay, a psychosis, and then and I know really it's not my area, but from what I do know, and you'll please help me out. Within schizophrenia, one could have a diagnosis of psychosis. In those people who are given, in other words, psychosis is a broader term, and then you can be more specific.
Well, you have in schizophrenia, you have what's called positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Positive would be delusions, and in this case would be a grandiose delusion, or a perceptual disturbances like hallucinations of all kind. And what's called negative symptoms are more impairments in the functioning, difficulties in the motivation, difficulties in the concentration.
Okay, so we're getting to a clinical thing. Now, the question that is at hand is as follows. Till now, all we've described is a person. Now, what's the halachic question? The halachic question is that this fellow got married. At some point, he got married, and now their question is they want a divorce. Now, what are the principles of the halachic principles? Who can give a divorce to their wife? Only a person who is aware, sane, rational, all of these type of things. Can this person now divorce his wife? His wife wants out, right? And that's what and this was a question that came to Rav Moshe. So just to put this into perspectives, we're not discussing this tonight. This is one of the, not one of the but for example, if a person, develops dementia, let's say, early onset dementia, right? And families then want to help the spouse. Let's say the male has dementia, early onset dementia, and then the female, could still, be, this could be somebody in his 50s, right? And the question is, if you wait too long, then that person can no longer give a get to his wife, right? So, at some point that may come up. No, but it has no relevance. But it's just the commonality is here. So listen to what happens the rest of the story. So at the end, Rav Moshe says, "V'sodarti es haget." Oh, I should have asked you the question, but okay. V'sodarti es haget. Rav Moshe says, "I created a get. I went ahead and did the get for them on such and such a day." Now we'll leave the last little lines. We'll come back to it. What are some of the problems with this scenario here? The problem is that the person has a diagnosis, right, as we've just heard, of psychosis. Now, the first thing is he a shota? That's the halachic question. So we'll go back to our definition of: did he sleep in the Beit HaKvarot? Did he sleep in the Beit HaKvarot? No, he did not. Did he tear his clothing? No, he did not. Did he travel at night by himself? We don't have evidence. But we have evidence of him doing other things. He's butt naked in the tree giving drushes. He's taking away people's clothing. I mean, he's doing other things. How do we see that? Do we see that and say, oh no, the Gemara doesn't apply because we have 3 versus 1, or things like that? So we'll see a psak in a moment from Rav Steinberg. But ultimately, Rav Moshe has a different approach to this. And Rav Moshe wants to basically make the following statement, which is a statement which we'll see in a moment is controversial. And I guess the question is, when you see a person in a psychotic state, at that moment, they're in the hospital, they're a Form 1, and whatever the case may be, that means that they're not rational. So the hospital will apply what is called a Form 1, and they will essentially hold them and keep them in a hospital. But what happens after they give them the medication? They give them some Haldol, and then he settles down. So, Haldol is given, he settles, everybody, and he's back to calm. What is his halachic status? In other words, the person who sleeps in other words, is it continuous, or is it something that, now we know that psychotic episodes, by definition, they come and go, they wax and wane, they peak and trough. That's the nature of what psychosis does. It's not a steady state throughout that. Now, if that is our definition of shota, then that means that becomes our definition for what is the standard of what is going to be the definition of shota. So with the person who sleeps in the thing. So if that's true, then are we not surprised that Rav Moshe then gave a get for this individual, or are we not surprised? In other words, how do we look at this? You want to say?
Just halakhically, purely, can you have a moment of facility where halakhically you say, okay, well, at this point you couldn't give a get. Here, at this moment you're lucid, you can, then you go back to being...
So that is exactly what Rav Moshe said. So Rav Moshe, that's the next 3 lines. So Rav Moshe took the opinion, basically he said, I'm going to give this person a get. Why? Because at that moment he seems to be in his zone, we'll call it. So the last one, the last 2 lines, he wants to take a different approach, which is interesting. It's more of a psychiatric approach, which is, how do you look at a person? In other words, if his one deficit is he thinks he's Mashiach, and from that he does 8 or 9 things that are incongruent with the world standards of normalcy, but it's perfectly sane with what he thinks. In other words, for him, being Mashiach means I could do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, but otherwise I have full faculty for everything else in my life. Everything else is perfect. Just that one area, I have a fallacy. It could be no different than someone who has an obsession or someone who has a fear, right? It's a narrow field, but everything else. So Rav Moshe first proposes that as being one way to sort of be able to give a get. And the other way that he basically says is, at the end of the day, it's what Elon was basically addressing, which was, at the end of the day, if he's in that zone when he's okay, then so be it. Then he's okay at that moment. And Rav Moshe, generally speaking, I don't want to generalize too much, but I mean, in a case otherwise, you're left with an aguna. So, there is a lot of pressure here to make that decision. So, on the one hand, you would say, hold on, this fellow meets the criteria for being a shota. If he's going to meet the criteria for a shota, and we're going to leave him as a shota all the time, then he will not be able to divorce his wife, and that woman is going to be stuck to this fellow who's not. Rav Moshe comes to the rescue and says, you know what, we're going to give a get in this case here. Now, why is this relevant to our children that we're discussing here? Because we're just trying to define what is the definition of a shota. That's really ultimately what we have. So we basically have learned that their cases in the Gemara seem to replicate something which might be psychotic in nature. This person was clearly psychotic in nature. On the other hand, there's windows of opportunity. So Rav Avram Steinberg, wrote the current textbook on halacha, and it's called Refuah Kehalacha. And there are four entries I want to share with you. The first one is how he addresses the 3 versus the 1 in the Gemara. So number 1, he says, I didn't number them, so it's 1, 2, number 3. Misha misnaheg ba'alil kashota gamur. One who clearly is behaving as a shota. V'hu misnaheg k'mishuga le'einenu. He doesn't even define that. He just says, you are mishuga in our eyes. In other words, exactly what the vernacular is. You are behaving in a mishuga different way. Then you know what? Dino kashota l'chol davar. You are a shota for all intents and purposes. Now, what does that mean? Remember what we said. That means that a person who is a shota does not have to put on tefillin, has no obligation. In other words, there's no. Let's be clear. The consequence of being labeled a shota, male or female, lends itself to complete no lack of obligation in mitzvos. That's what it is. A shota is not obligated in mitzvos. So, once you call somebody, you classify that individual as a shota, the implications are huge. Implications being you don't have any worries about any obligations, whether it be Shabbos, whether it be Yom Tov, whether it be get, whether it be anything at all. Now, with the get, it's a problem, because now the flip side is that you are married and now you can't get out of it. But leaving aside that if it wasn't, then that's not the issue. So
be a shota is not a permanent state. It's just transitory.
Correct. Well, we're going to keep saying that. That is going to be the fundamental difference. That will come up several times this evening. So, in other words, with psychosis, the question is going to be, it'll be these 3 things. You have periods of psychosis. Those are the times when you are classified as a shota.
But traditionally, how was defined a shota?
Well, we don't know. We don't know. We don't know because we have only the 3 cases. Does that mean that the person stayed in the cemetery for his whole life? Don't think so. But that was called a shota. So Rav Steinberg basically says, Gam im ein bo echad mi'asimanim hamenuyim b'chazal. Even if the person has not one of the criteria listed in the Gemara. In other words, Rav Steinberg takes the opinion that the cases that were brought down in the Gemara, tearing clothing and things of that nature, are just examples of minei shtus. It doesn't mean that you have to go and sleep in a cemetery, right? You don't have. That's not the criteria. So that's point number 1 he makes. Point number 2 that he makes is that B'yameinu hiskabel al das haposkim shekol mi sherofim mumchim betchum machalos hanefesh. When it comes to reputable mumchim, experts in the area of mental health, psychiatrists, and they say that person has kogovim shehu sovel b'kvius machalas nefesh chamuros umugdaros ve'ein lo kol shikul das uvekosher shiput harehu shote legamur lechol davar vinyan. So, in a case where a person has these type of difficulties, for that purpose and that time, that person is called a shota. Third point he's going to make, and then we'll wrap them all together. Shota shekibel tipul trufati. In other words, a person who got his medication, he got his Haldol, or he takes his antipsychotic medication all the time, and now we have this transient period in which he's well in between. The psychosis they have recovered. Ubashbat hatrufa hu mitkaped betzurat tikina. He now behaves in a repaired function. Nechshav kitim chalem ledor. And then he's like any other person who is ill. So what we come out with this from this series of definition of shota, just to make it clear, is it's periods of psychosis which come and go. They are transient. During the period of time when a person is in that level of psychosis, they gain the status, or they acquire the status, I should say, of being a shota. Shota comes with huge implications, because the first principle is that you are not obligated. Cheresh, shota, v'katan are excused from the mitzvos. That's huge in terms of what it is. So the obligations to that person. So if we're going to come back to our discussion, which is going to be cognitive delay, and we're going to find that this individual meets the criteria for shota. So now, in shota, is there any challenge? Is there any concern about cognitive here? Impairment? Nothing. There's nothing about cognitive impairment. This is a perfectly sane individual. Well, not sane. This is a perfectly intelligent individual. Can have an IQ in the stratosphere. But if they have these moments of psychosis, at that moment in time, they are in the category of shota, and therefore not obligated. They don't have to come to the Megillah. They don't have to put on their tefillin, and so on and so forth. Okay. Let's contrast that with now what we're going to call the peti or the pesi. Now, what is a pesi exactly? So, we know from the Gemara doesn't talk about cheresh, shota, v'katan, v'pesi. That's a whole different story. So we need a definition for what pesi is. So we look in the Shulchan Aruch as to what it's going to be. Hapeta'im biyoter. So these are people who are, when he adds the word biyoter. So it's an adjective on a peti. So very, very much cognitively impaired. And we'll try to define it in a few moments. She'ein makirin devarim shesostrim zeh. So the Shulchan Aruch lays out a very, very broad sense of what that's going to be, which is they don't understand things which are contradictory in nature. That's a very loosey-goosey kind of definition, right? I mean, at some point you would wonder if your neighbor meets that kind of a criteria, seriously, they come, they mow your lawn, I don't know, it seems like it's contradictory in nature, but it's very, very vague. Now they're saying, well, he doesn't understand things like other people do. Well, I don't know what that means. So if you have a Democrat and a Republican living on the same street, how does that? Do you really, really understand a democratic mindset? It's like, are you? So I'm not trying to be humorous. I'm just trying to just define it in a more concrete manner. But it Be'er says kederach shemivinim hasham haaretz. We're living now in the most at times when you would say, "Are you kidding me?" Like how many times have we said, "Are you kidding me?" in the last 2 months, right? So what does that mean? That the entire world is pesi? You may say, yeah, the whole world is pesi. Maybe they're all shota. I think we're going to get into this. But you understand what I'm saying? These are still very vague definitions. They're not helping us very much. V'chein hamu havalim v'nechpazim bedatam. They are mixed up in their minds. Well, how many times have we told that about people that we know? Now what he says is they are now subsumed under the category of shota. That's a tremendous statement. Now what you've done is you've taken this category, if you read the Shulchan Aruch without any further explanations, and what basically have said is this category of individual who we are going to call a shota, a pesi, because they're very weak in their cognitive abilities, we're going to subsume them within the classification of shota. Now, if that's true, that means anyone. Let's assume, for argument's sake, that the Shulchan Aruch is referring to a person with intellectual disability. Let's make it a person with Down syndrome. Let's make it a person who has had a WISC test and he comes out with a 65. So, generally speaking, below 70 would put you into that level of cognitive, delay. You would get a diagnosis of either intellectual disability, mild intellectual disability. So now, according to the Shulchan Aruch, you're part of a shota. Now, if that's true, that changes a lot, because now this person does not have psychosis. His symptoms are not transient. This person's symptoms are continuous all the way through. Now, if he is in the category of shota, do the parents have to buy that individual, the pesi, IQ of 70, Down syndrome, do they have to buy him tefillin when he turns 13 years old? Does he have to put on tefillin? So if you read the Shulchan Aruch as it's written here, the answer is, well, hold on, it falls into the category of... So Pesi and Shota get merged together. Not so fast. So we're going to go into now some discussion that that we're going to disprove that last statement. And I'll explain it to you outside first, and then we'll say it inside. These halachas here, the halacha that I quoted from, are from Hilchas Edus. And what we're going to see now from the, we see here, Sefer Me'iras Einayim, which is written on Choshen Mishpat. We're going to see it also in the Chuvas of Rav Moshe. They're basically going to say, you have to read it, I'm sorry to use this again, in context. The context here is that we are dealing with halachas that deal with the law, the court of law. In other words, what the Shulchan Aruch is basically going to tell us, has told us, is that a person who is of inferior quality, inferior cognitive ability, let me try to be careful with my words here, inferior cognitive ability, for the purpose of courts, has a din of a shota, but does not mean that it applies to everything else. The context is the context of this halacha. So when a judge is going to bring to, if let's say, for example, they're going to bring a child with, when I say child, now we're going to say a bar mitzvah boy, a 14-year-old boy, to give testimony in court. The child has Down syndrome. His IQ is known to be 65. And he tells us the story that, yes, he saw Mr. Greenberg do this to Mr. He stole the money. Do we believe him in court? He's able to repeat those words. I saw this thing here. So the halacha is that when it comes to anything that deals with a legal matter in court, that individual is seen as a shota and his testimony is disqualified. But that does not mean that it applies to everything else. So if you don't believe what I just said, or you do, but we'll read it inside, but that's what we're going to be saying. So the Me'iras Einayim says, "Dezehu achiluk ben pesi l'shota." The difference between a pesi and a shota is as follows: Shehashota dato hi mishoveves u'mitorefes legamri b'dvar mehadvarim. A shota gets mixed up from time to time, right? And he undergoes a turbulent mind. Ma she'en kein pesi she'ena mituref legamri. Pesis are happy. They're good, stable, all is good, right? Avol mitzad ached, but from another side, hu goreya me'ashota, truthfully told, he says he's worse off than a shota. Why? Shehashota shar devarim hu chacham kashar b'nei adam. Aside from the fact that he thinks he's Mashiach, you can have an intelligent conversation with him about sports, the weather, politics maybe, right? He can have a conversation. Don't get into the Mashiach discussion with him, right? How many family members do you know? You invite them over, but don't talk politics. Once you talk politics, you know that it's like, you lost it. The hapesi, but the other hand, the pesi, she'ein lo shikul gamor. He has no seichel whatsoever. Ve'eno mevin shum davar kadesh mevin ranyazam. Now, punchline. The bichlal shote yechashav. In this case here, we're going to count him as a v'hainu ledin pesul when it comes to disqualification in a court. Avolav shem shota alav. We're not going to apply the din of shota across the board. So now we see that what seemingly was going to be how we're going to define it changes it tremendously. Now what we're doing is we're saying is that a person who has a cognitive disability is not a shota. He keeps that status. Rav Moshe, next tshuva. Hine, vada iko chiluk ben shota ben pesi. He says, of course there's a difference between a shota and a pesi. Underlined part. Sheshota lo tolo bikishranos havanas devarim vinyanim. A shota, it is not cognitive dependent. As we've already established, you could be very intelligent and yet have moments of psychosis. Skip the line to the next paragraph. Avol peti, but a person who's a pesi, hu mishedato klishta. A person of a weak intellect. Very, very different phenomenon, okay? And he explains and he goes into some of the things, but we're just going to move on. And the next source on the next page, the Mincha Shlomo, pretty much says the same story. The difference between the two. So now, if we're going to use that as our working definition is going to be, a shota is going to be an intelligent individual, which is surprising. Because before anybody thought about that, if someone were to say, what is the definition of a shota, you would have thought, not very, very smart. Now we're saying, no, it could be perfectly perfectly smart, intelligent, intellectually, everything, but has these moments of, essentially, disturbance. Pesi, on the other hand, is going to be cognitively low thing. it will become important to determine what level. So again, no one has to be a psychologist really in the thing, but from a practical parent, the parents will have to know. Because if we're going to talk about the first halacha, which is, halachas that pertain to, I'm on the next page there, now we're going to get into some of the questions. Number one, I'm going to talk about, depending on time, we're going to go obligation to do mitzvos, bar mitzvah, bringing to shul. The fundamental approach to all of these questions is going to be the same, and it's going to be a repeating story, and I'm going to bring different sources for each different one. But if you understand the principle, now you can at least apply it to the practical, which is going to be, the first question that we have to decide is, what is the definition that we are talking about? So you cannot use terms anymore like autism. You can't use terms like high-functioning autism. Anxiety is not going to help me at all, right? Psychosis is not going to help me. What I want to know is, I need to understand, is this individual, from a psychosis point of view, going through periods in which they are completely psychotic at points, and we are going to say at those moments, if they're not on medication, they have a category which is called shota, cheresh, shota, v'katan. They are absolved from all mitzvahs. They have no obligations. And from that perspective, what you can do, or they can do, in terms of Shabbos and feeding them and all these kinds of things, is completely different than a person who is intellectually below a level. The question that we have to ask ourselves is, how low is too low? I gave you an example of Down syndrome with an IQ of about 65. So that would be an average individual with IQ. But that person is friendly, can say hello and things of that nature. That is going to be called a PESI. Is that going to be the same halacha? What would be the halacha to a child with autism again, but now nonverbal? Right? Now we have a nonverbal child, not an IQ of 70, an IQ that is not recordable, right? Basically, very, 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 very low fun. Nonverbal, not able to communicate. How does that change that? And that is where we're going to go with this here. So the obligation to do mitzvos is the first thing that we have to discuss. So Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Moshe Feinstein literally almost say the same thing. I'm going to choose to read it in Rav Moshe because it's the print is a little bit clearer. It's in the second one there. And he's talking about here a petty. Vihine petty in brackets because, this is, again, I keep saying that, this is the shaila of the petty. Shevadai chayavim b'mitzvahs. Now, we're talking about, for this case here, if you were going to put a little petty, you would say, this is the Down syndrome child, IQ 65. This is what we're talking about here. So are they obligated in mitzvahs? Says Rav Moshe, absolutely. When they reach maturity like anybody else, a 12 years old, 13 years old boy, for a girl or boy, then there is an obligation on the parents, the lamdam masha'efshel lahem, you have to teach them as they can, as they're able to. In this tshuva, Rav Moshe goes on, and this, if I ever, would ever, speak like at a Danny place, it talks about the responsibility, the communal responsibility to educate these children. Communal responsibility, that there is an obligation, right, from a community perspective to ensure. He talks about interesting in ratios of students to how many is reasonable. He talks about 25 to 1. And he says, these children can't handle 25 to 1. And you're going to need how many teachers for them? He proposes 3. Again, Rav Moshe, may not have had a degree in a certificate in teaching, but he understood that 1 in 25, you can't just take a child, put them into school, and say you're Yotze. And Rav Moshe was basically saying you got to find 3. They need 3 teachers. I don't know where he came up with the number, but that's what he came up with. And the responsibility in the community to support this level of thing, he really goes on there. Okay. But now he's going to get into that technical question that we left open. So we've said fine, that is fine for the child with Down syndrome. But what about if the child is less than that? Now, what about if a person, when he matures, he's going to be, when he's 14, 15 years old, he only has the cognitive capacity of a 4-year-old. He's going to say, that is the proposal here. So he says, in this case here, you can't teach it this individual. He's at that level. Nami ein patur mi mitzvos midin shota. Hold on a second. Cognitive age 4 is not yet the category of a shota. In other words, you still are. So the irony is, a person with a PhD, right, who becomes a shota at some point, does not have to put on tefillin. Yet a child who is 15 years old, who functions at the level of a 4-year-old, is obligated in mitzvos. And this is going to have ramifications as we go through the rest of the discussion. So, to read it inside, of course, nami eno pater mi mitzvos midin shote, shelo nitzdav klal elo midin ones. The mitzad had tzivui mistaber shu b'chla. Absolutely, he is obligated in the mitzvahs. Umemela, and therefore yesh al horav, on his parents limono milavor alav. The parents would have to now prohibit that individual from, or refrain, right, or block, or whatever, however you want to interpret this word, from being over a Torah obligation. So what does that mean? If you have a child who's 15 years old, God forbid, a child is 15 years old, but he has the intellectual capacity of a 4-year-old, and now he reaches for something which is non-kosher, do the parents have an obligation to stop them? Now you see that the answer is yes. Yet the psychotic PhD, no problem. Because that individual, in his moment, when he's, for example, hospitalized, he can eat whatever he wants. Right? Take a person admitted to the hospital, he's in that moment, there's a Form 1. I'm not paskening a shaila, by the way, I'm just saying that's the point that we have to understand. And therefore, now he comes to the third category. Last line here. Efshir shebe'ein lo das klal. So Rav Moshe wonders now, what about if the child has not a 4-year-old level, but rather he only has afilu kiputos, a toddler. Now, it's interesting that in the discussion of what Rav Moshe understands as a toddler, and you'll see this in the in Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, I have to say, I don't know if my toddlers were it's like, I'm going to read you what Rav Shlomo Zalman thinks of a toddler. This is a toddler. Torah. How many of your toddlers? No, I mean, Hashem is at the mountain. Maybe there are some, right? So listen to it. Shakadosh Baruch Hu nasan lanu Torah, va'anachnu mekayimim mitzvosav, and we now do the mitzvahs. Shapir chashiv. Definitions are going to be, interesting here, but how Rosh Shlomo Zalman and Sidor, but they say the same thing. They say basically, the next level is toddler level. So what is a toddler level? Let's call it 18 to 24 months. So in my world of, pediatrics, these are kids who are just beginning to speak. Just beginning. Where's your nose? Where's your eyes? They can be a little bit of the receptive, one step, barely kind of thing. That's the kind of level that is 18 to 24 months. That's the cognitive level of where you are. Where are your body parts? Where's mommy? Give it to daddy. Put this in the diaper. Put the diaper in the garbage. Basic one-step commands. So Rav Moshe basically says, when you're at that level, right? So just imagine now a 15-year-old, put whatever diagnosis you want. Cerebral palsy, autism, MID. But no, it can't be MID because it's way below that. It's already GDD, global developmental delay. So now, lo shayach lomer, he says over here, lo shayach lomer shu b'chlal hachiyuv. There's no obligation. So it's interesting that the cognitive goes through like sort of phases. 0 to 18 months, right? In other words, if it's below 18 months, you're actually a shota. 18 months and above, right? And certainly if you're beyond the age of 4 to 5 in terms of cognitive, you're then obligated in all of the mitzvahs there. So that would be the definition of what we're going to do. So if we're going to start plugging in that approach in the next few minutes, just to go through the various questions, we're going to go through them. So let's take a bar mitzvah. By now you should already, that's it. I could walk away. I've left with, I hope, enough information. So now, family comes over to this Rabinovitz. I want to thank Rabbi Koropkin for this source. He showed it to me. And so they asked him, basically a child with autism, and they want to make a bar mitzvah. Now, again, that's not a question that is answerable. If someone sends a question, hi, they have a child with autism, and they want to know, can they make a bar mitzvah? Can he get an aliyah to the Torah? Can he get tefillin? What's the information that we need?
Functional.
Absolutely. Otherwise, the diagnosis is of no value. 0. It doesn't make any difference, right? And that's probably true in many other areas. And that's why I started this year by saying, we've got to stay away from this idea of mental health and diagnosis, because that just lumps everything together. Even in autism, we have to stratify. So when the question was asked, and I have to give credit here, Rabbi Venos nails it. I mean, not that he needs my askama, but he really just addresses it in the following way. He says, Mishpachto, I'm going to read this in Hebrew because it's very nice the way he puts it. Mishpachto sheyeled autist, a family of an autistic child, they want to prepare him a bar mitzvah. The first thing to do is to basically ascertain, where is this child? Ha'im hu mugdar k'mechuyav b'mitzvah solo. Is he even in the parsha of needing of being mechuyav in mitzvos? In other words, just because he has a diagnosis of autism, you haven't told me anything about him. There are children with autism who go to school, finish university, go on to university, and finish high school and go to university, and so on and so forth. And there's others who are still nonverbal at the age of 7, 8, 9, and 10, and they're banging the walls in the house and becomes. And he says, if he has the cognitive ability that he's now available in mitzvahs, if he now, the parents have to make a decision. When you put on tefillin, one of the criteria putting on tefillin is a specific halacha with tefillin. It's not the same halacha for lulav and esrog. The criteria for tefillin is, can you be careful of your body? Right? In other words, don't do things while you're wearing tefillin. I don't have to explain what that means, right? People understand, right? So it means taking care of your continence. It means taking care of the sounds one makes, and the drooling, and all of these aspects. So all of this is what he says. If a child meets that criteria, even for a short period of time, then absolutely, and then he should. Sarich lahaniach lo tefillin lizman zeh. You have to put on tefillin on that individual. V'chein haminig la, and then you can also call him to the Torah. Nothing wrong, right? I attended a bar mitzvah of a child with autism. Very, very right. It was a very, very one of the most moving bar mitzvahs, really. But again, you have to know what that child understands. Now he continues. But if on the other hand we all recognize that child is not of the capacity, right? And I shouldn't be so stuck on verbal or nonverbal, because there are many people that are nonverbal but are highly intelligent, and they prove it to you. I saw a child today in my office. The guy he does math, he does 3-digit math, but he doesn't speak yet. He has autism. So it's a fascinating thing. So again, but in general, it's a safe generality to say that generally if they're nonverbal, they suffer a great deal of intellectual disability. But this child was one of those. So in that case there, the opposite. Asur lahaniach lo tefillin. You can't buy the tefillin. Not that the parents are not required to buy the tefillin. It's asur. Because now you have problems with putting on tefillin on a person that really should not have it. It brings up bracha levatala, and so on and so forth. Next, we have a few more minutes. Bringing the child to shul. So again, you ask a question: should you bring the child? Tell me what you're talking about, right? Adults talk in shul too, so they shouldn't come to shul either, right? The shalah was against bringing healthy children to shul. At all. Very, very much. And his lashon is tagar. He very, very much protested. Because again, that was the mentality of the shalah. Shul is shul and things like that. We've grown accustomed to have children in shul and things like that, and that's that tension and that balance. That you have a bar mitzvah, you have a lot of family. Last week we were busy, but you want to know, can you have that? But so Rav Moshe was that, bringing them to shul. So we'll read through this here. Number 3. He doesn't say about the obligation to bring him to shul. He's now talking about that the people in the shul have a responsibility to greet that person nicely and to welcome him and to make them feel welcome, right? And here he's talking about the petty. He's not talking about the shota. He's talking about a petty. So he's talking about a young child. Again, in our discussion, it's basically been a child with Down syndrome. I'm happy to say our shul was very, very, very proactive in having a child with Down syndrome participating and feeling very welcome in our shul. And this is basically along the lines of what Moshe is saying. Vada, you have to do this. This is absolutely V'gami, and you should try that he should answer Amen in Kedusha. So clearly there's some cognitive ability there. He might be 7, 8, 9 years behind his peers, but nonetheless. The issue, the next one here is kashrus. It's a long discussion, and it's in itself is a fundamental. And the famous tshuva is of the Chassam Sofer, and the nutshell of the shaila of the Chassam Sofer was as follows: that a child with an intellectual disability was living in a city, and they came to the Chassam Sofer and they said, "Can we put this child in an institution, but there will not be kosher food for that child?" And how would the Chassam Sofer feel about that? So in a case like that, the Chassam Sofer said, so what are the problems with that? Number one, there's a difference between a person feeding a person food that is not kosher. That's one issue. The other one is if it happens, you for example, admit the person to an institution and then food is passed to them. There's a fundamental difference between a person giving, like a mother, giving the child a non-kosher chocolate bar versus you put the child into an institution in which non-kosher chocolate bars are given. There's a fundamental difference between the two. So it says and this is the classic tshuva that is brought down, by everybody who discusses this topic. Imkain hachi shara. He says it's allowed. It's permissible. He allowed the child to go. Again, the details of the case are that they felt that the child needed some services, some therapeutics that were not available locally. And he talks about it was in Vienna and they didn't have these kind of things, but they had to go to this institution. So he says, I allow that in this case here on the condition, ubitnai k'shiagil leben yud gimel shanim v'yamecha, when he comes out, when he's bar mitzvah, you have to take him back out. So what he's basically saying is, he's not a case of a shota, because if it would be a case of a shota, he would be absolved from all the mitzvahs all the time. So he's saying, no, in a case like that. And once he turns 13, the Chassam Sofer was not happy about that here. I'm going to go quickly just because I see the time is running short, but I want to at least cover the areas of kashrus. So the Tzitz Eliezer has a tshuva on this. Rav Moshe has a tshuva on this. Let's turn the page to the one with Rav Moshe. Rav Moshe talks about the case of a person, I think I alluded to this already, B'shote Gamor. So this would be the case of a patient with psychosis. Comes to the hospital, and now it's in a small hospital, and they don't have kosher food for that individual. So he says, I explained this already. Medina ain le'esor le'mosra le'mosad institution shala medinas. He says avol la'maisa ain lasos. He says, technically speaking, there's no prohibition. He says, if that's what it takes to admit a person to an institution, he says there is no prohibition. But Rav Moshe in his way always writes, says, "Aval lamaisa ein lasos." He says it bothers him to do this. In other words, he tries to say, if you can figure out a way, but he's giving you the halacha. The halacha is a shoteh, you're permitted to go. We talked about the legal matters already because I said before that when it comes to the case of testifying in court, that is when there's going to be very much a parallel between the shota and the petty. There, you have to just understand, because in court we don't allow the petty, the child with Down syndrome, even though he's putting on tefillin or whatever the case is, but there we don't allow that. And I want to just finish up with maybe the idea of the last one, number 8. I'll skip over the other things, teaching Torah and things like that, because this is one of the most common ones, and we'll read this one and we'll conclude with this. And this is the whole Shabbos question. So just to set this up, the case is going to be the child now has a lot of difficulty with behavior, regulation, and the only thing that calms him down is the iPad. So based on what we said tonight and how we've approached this, the first thing that we want to know about the child with autism and the iPad is going to be, what is the cognitive ability? If the child with Down syndrome wants to listen to music to calm down, I'm sure you'd all agree, based on after listening tonight to the shir, there's just no way that you'd be able to say that this is going to be a heter. Now, having said that, I have to be very careful, because a lot of times when you read articles from here and from there, things like that, and they lump mental health together, they give a lot of blank heterim for that. For example, they basically say anybody who has a mental health disorder is by definition a chola she'ein bo sakana. And a chola she'ein bo sakana means that now you can ask a goy to do something for you. Well, hold on a second. Well, is that really, really true? Person has anxiety. So I think it needs a little bit more of a drill down before you just lump all this together. But let's just finish with our case here. So this is talking about here a case that was asked of the Nishmas Avram. The Nishmas Avram is Professor Avram, and he was a Talmud of Rav Newert, who wrote the Shmir Shabbos K'Hilchaso. He's a physician, a British trained physician. Worked in I believe Shari Tzedek. Wrote Svarim on medical halacha. He was asked the following question, and we'll conclude with this. Sha'al Abba al Beno had, he's basically a 9-year-old with autism. He says, and now he's going to tell us a little bit about the medical profile of this person. So he's going to be basically, he says, autism kasha. In other words, it's severe. type of autism. What does he mean by that? Eina musuchak umskasheri tani doesn't play with us. B'nei mishpato rag lagabe return l'mashal kasher hu me'unyan lo'echol when he wants to eat. L'sharet o l'tzeis when he wants to go outside to the chatzer to the garden. Ukedome what does he do? Hu moshech he pulls udrags umazbir b'darko es ratzono and he says that's how he talks. So what are you getting in the sense? He's very very low functioning, non-verbal type of individual here. Okay, and what's the halachic question here? The halachic question is as follows: Matzav rucho olem me'od atzuv. He gets very depressed from time to time. Rogez lachutz ve'az. What do we do? Muvan shekol habayis and the whole family. Everybody is very nervous about him. So what do? We go into the car, right? That's what we do. We go for a ride in the car. So you see where this question is coming. Can you go for a ride on Shabbos with this fellow, right? So the person has autism, severe autism. And he gets very depressed, he gets very angry, he gets dysregulated, and he's going to lose it there. So we will skip over to that's basically the case. He describes going to the car. So in Anisi lo, I'm in the last paragraph. Shekol zman shelo medubar al pikuach nefesh. As you have not mentioned anything about pikuach nefesh, he says, Ein kol heter lechalol Shabbos. And you have no heter to be mechalol Shabbos, right? Because what category are you going to put him in? Yes, he might be a chola, right? He has a degree, he has a diagnosis, whatever it's going to be. But he's not a pikuach nefesh at the end of the day. So just to say you're going to get into the car and drive him in the car, on what basis are you going to do that? Like, where does that come from? So he says, no, it's like this. Ein kol heter lechalol Shabbos b'surah Torah al yidei Yehudi. Can't do that through a Jew. But you can make up in advance imgoy with a Gentile. Sheyaskim lavo lakachas a yelad who will agree to take the child. Yachad also imishto, even with his wife. V'hu with him or ben gadaloch. And there's one other person. You have to have another person in the car with the person, right? A woman who's pregnant on the way to the hospital, going to deliver. The husband goes with, right? So he's not the sick one, but So at the end he concludes. Im kach dorish haben lisivu berakav b'shoas hatzorah b'matzav k'fi shumazeh. They go for a ride as much as they need. That's what it takes to calm down the child. That's what it's going to take. And v'azay mutar l'tzatzel alav lavo. You can call the person. The basic principle here is going to be you first have to define what is the nature of the chola. That's the first and foremost. And in a case where the person is in the case here, it's not a blanket heter. Now, based on what we said here, you could make an argument. And I could make an argument that if this person's cognitive function was really, really below, right, and he was at a toddler level, then he would have no mitzvahs. Then I am not allowed to drive him, but he can be driven by, there's a difference operating here. I, as a Jew, as an adult Jew, can do something for another adult Jew, for anybody, pikuach nefesh, right? But now, if another person doesn't have any mitzvos, if he can do it for himself, be my guest. So if the child was of the ability, and he is below the functional age of, let's say, 18 months is what we said, but he can still manage to do an iPad, there would be no obligation to take that away from that individual. If he's at a level of 4, 5, 6 years old, now you'd run into problems where you would have that. So bottom line is going to be, all of these questions center around the following. You first have to decide what is the category. Is the individual a shota? And shota implies that there is no obligation of mitzvahs at that time, and whether it comes to all the things that we've discussed, there would be a blank, there would be a heter, or the person is a petty. If he's a petty, we have to define at what level, because up to the age of 18 months, that would still be a petty with obligations to mitzvos. Below 18 months of age, you revert back to a shota, and at that level, you have no obligations again. So fundamentally knowing what it is, and then each case, of course. Now, none of these are halacha l'maisa. Please, of course, everyone asks the Rav on any of these specifics, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview. I'm okay to stay for questions if anybody wants to ask, but I would like to wrap up at this point.